Many thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. So over the years, as I continue to strive for post-processing improvement within my own photos, the reasons, or I guess I should say the list of reasons that I have to jump from Lightroom into Photoshop to finish an edit seems to grow. And there used to be only one or maybe two things I did inside of Photoshop that Lightroom just couldn't handle or just couldn't handle well. But now that list is up to about 6 specific editing techniques that I frequently find myself needing to jump from Lightroom into Photoshop to complete. And it's at the point now to where just about every single image I edit eventually has to be finished inside of Photoshop. And that could be caused by the need to apply a singular editing technique. It could be caused by a desire to, or a need to do a multitude of different techniques, just depending on the individual image that I happen to be editing at that time. And in this video, I want to share with you the 6 reasons why I typically have to abandon Lightroom in order to finish an edit inside of Photoshop. And in no particular order whatsoever, the very first reason is the need to perform cleanup. Cleanup is something I do on just about every single one of my photographs, and I find that the tools available to us inside of Lightroom are somewhat subpar, or they just don't quite do as good of a job in most situations in my personal experience. And I'll show you what I mean right here. So this is an image from my recent trip to Utah. This is not a completed image. I actually just started editing this image the other day, but by the time this video goes live, I should have the completed version of this photograph up on my Instagram page, so if you want to check that out. But what I mean by spot removal, so let's say that we want to come over here and remove this red flower. I wouldn't want to remove this red flower in this situation. I actually like this pop of red color in this particular image, but it's a good example for this. So if I come up here to spot removal, we'll start with clone. Let me increase the size of this and just select that area right there. And you can see the area that it's selected. It copied this area and brought it over here. We do have the ability to drag it wherever we want, but it's ultimately just making a mirror copy of an area of that actual, of the area that we want to remove, or I should say that the area that we want to clone for that specific area. We can switch this to heal and try that as well. And once again, it pretty much does the same thing. It's just copying another area that Lightroom thinks is a good replica for that specific area. And in my experience, that just doesn't always work well, especially if you have a lot of different areas that you want to remove items from. You end up with just a bunch of duplicates of other areas, and it just doesn't create a very realistic look. But in Photoshop, however, this is the technique that I will usually go through. Let me just zoom in here to that flower. So about right here. Whoops. There, it looks good. I always come over here to the patch tool, and then I'll just draw a little circle around the area that I want to remove, and then go up here to edit, fill, make sure content aware fill is selected, and hit OK. And as you can see, that created a much more realistic look. And the reason I do like that, let me just undo that because I don't want to remove that flower. The reason I like to do that is because, or the reason I like to do that inside of Photoshop is because it's not creating that mirror copy of another area. It's just basically Photoshop's doing its wizardry and just selecting a variation of the areas around it to ultimately create what it feels is a good fill for that particular item that you want to remove. So I do all of my cleanup inside of Photoshop, and I no longer do any of that inside of Lightroom. Now, the second reason that I always have to abandon Lightroom for Photoshop is sharpening. Now, that's not to say that Lightroom is subpar when it comes to sharpening. I just find that Photoshop provides more different types of sharpening methods, and it also provides more customizations for those types of sharpening methods. So what I used to do, and I think what most people do inside of Lightroom for sharpening is, just come to the details section, bring the sharpening up, maybe increase the radius a touch, maybe bring the detail up to around 50-ish. Of course, you can mask it out, which I think is definitely a good feature. And if we zoom into a specific area, we toggle this on and off. That's before sharpening and after sharpening, before and after. And it actually did a pretty good job. And I think that Lightroom has a pretty robust sharpening engine built into it. But once again, I think that Photoshop just has more options and more flexibility for you. So what I normally will do, let me just come over here. Let me delete that layer right there. We'll come up to filter, and go to Other, down to High Pass. This is one of two sharpening methods that I usually apply. And I would usually leave this on somewhere between maybe 2.5 to 3.5. I generally don't do a ton of sharpening on my photographs, but when I do, these are the methods I go through. So if I leave High Pass on 3 pixels and just select OK, obviously that does not look good at all. But if you look really closely, you can see what it's doing is basically just identifying all the edges of the photograph to apply sharpening to. And then I'm going to come down here to the blend mode, and I usually will use soft light as the blend mode. And if we zoom in, let me just do Command plus to zoom in. Anybody else have any issues with the new Photoshop update when it comes to zooming and scrolling? I find it to be so laggy. But so we'll zoom into this area, maybe not even quite that much, and just toggle this on and off. So that's before sharpening and after, before and after. And you can definitely see it's very subtle. But what's cool is you have different blend modes that you can use. So if we change this from soft light to hard light, that's actually going to increase that sharpening. That's before and after. We could change this to vivid light, which is going to increase that sharpening even more. As I toggle this on and off, you can see that difference. I usually will leave it on soft light, or maybe I'll leave it on hard light, and I'll just reduce the opacity. That's another nice feature, is because you can reduce the opacity of that particular sharpening layer as well. So lots of different options. And then the other thing that I would like to do sometimes is I'll come up here to Filter, Sharpen, and down here to Smart Sharpen. Smart Sharpen works similar to the way that Lightroom's interface works for sharpening. You have your amount here, your radius, you can reduce noise, but what's cool is in the shadows and the highlights, you can also determine exactly how much sharpening you want in the shadows and the highlights, so that works really good as well. But those are generally the two sharpening methods that I will use inside of Photoshop, and I find that that creates more flexible options for sharpening and better results as well. So let me go back here to Lightroom. Now, the third thing I guess, editing technique that I have to leave Lightroom for Photoshop for is the Orion Effect. Now, there's a couple different ways that you can create a somewhat similar, kind of similar effect inside of Lightroom, but there's really no replica for, or no replacing the Orion Effect inside of Photoshop. So what I will do for that, let me just create a merge visible stamp layer right here. And what I will do is come up here to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And for this particular image, this image was shot on my Fuji X-T4, which is a 26 megapixel camera. So I'm just going to change this pixel radius to right at 26 and hit OK. Then I come up here to Image, Adjustments, Brightness, Contrast. And then I like to add around 50-ish brightness, contrast around 75 or 80. This is going to kind of create that glowy ethereal kind of effect, and then just hit OK. And then I am going to come up here to luminosity masking. I use Lumenzia for that. Let's try L2. And ultimately what I want to do is I want to take that Orion effect and I only want to apply it to the highlights of my photograph, because after all, highlights glow, light glows, shadows don't glow. So I want to make sure that I'm not creating that glowing effect inside of my shadows. So everything in white is areas of highlight. So I think that looks good right there. And then let's just hit mask. And this will take a second. And then as you can see, that glowing effect is only in the highlight areas of the actual photograph. And then we're going to reduce the opacity somewhere to around 15 or maybe 20%. And this might be difficult to see on camera or on a screen record, but I will do my best. This is before and after, before and after. And I think that the Orion effect is something I don't do it on every single one of my photographs, but I do it on the vast majority of them. But the real key, in my opinion, is just to make sure that you get kind of targeted where you put that Orion effect and make sure that you don't have that glowing look inside of your shadows and kind of reserve it only for that highlight area. I really like the overall look that it provides. It creates that kind of a ethereal look, as you can see right here. If I zoom all the way out, before and after, before and after. And I just kind of like the way that it just kind of softens things down just a touch. Now, the fourth, are we on 4? Yeah. The fourth thing that editing technique that I always do inside of Photoshop is luminosity masking. Now, I think, and I've spoken about this many times, that the introduction of range masks inside of Lightroom was hands down the best thing that Lightroom ever applied. And range masks are insanely powerful. But Photoshop using luminosity masking is definitely a more robust option if you need to get very, very targeted. So let me go to a different image right here. This is the image right here that I posted last week on Instagram and across various other social media channels. But if I come over here to this image right here, and let's say that I just want to target those highlights area in the back of the overall photograph, that's kind of getting that glowing reflected light in the slot canyon, in the narrows right through here. But if I come up here, this is Lumenzia right through here. I'm going to select these different types of luminosity ranges. So you have dark, you have your darks, your midtones, and your lights here. I can do L2, I can do L3, and as you can see, it's getting darker and darker. Maybe L2, and I ultimately only want the areas to be highlighted in white for those exact highlights. So once that luminosity mask gets to a point to where I like, then I can go ahead and select it there. And I think that looks good. And if I just select the curves right here, and once this loads, I'll now have the ability to only affect that particular area. So I can come up here and I can increase that exposure a touch, I can decrease it just a little bit, and it's just a very targeted way. And as you can see, as I move this back and forth, how that is affecting. And there's a ton of benefits of using luminosity masking inside of Photoshop. And it's the same thing as range masks inside of Lightroom, but you just have much more power inside of Photoshop. Not to take anything away from range masks in Lightroom, because before the introduction of that, there was nothing even close to luminosity masking inside of Lightroom. Thankfully, with range masks, that is no longer the case. But luminosity mask inside of Photoshop just kind of takes that to an entirely new level. Now, the fifth thing is local contrast. So in sticking with the theme of luminosity mask, my favorite thing to do, and I do this on every single one of my photographs, is I apply local contrast using luminosity masks. So sticking with this same image right here, this is the raw photo, by the way, of this image right here. So if I come over here, let's say that I just want to add some contrast to maybe these darker edges of the canyon behind in the background. I can come up here to D2, maybe that's not quite as targeted, D3, D4. Now we're starting to get somewhere, maybe D5. So everything in white are are darker shadows, and these are going to be the areas that I want to apply contrast. So I can just simply come up here and just select contrast, and the Lumenzia will automatically add contrast to that selection. And what's really cool is I can increase the opacity of that selection to 100% just to make it easier to see. That's before and after, before and after. Let me delete that and do another one up here that might even be easier to see. So let's say that I want to add contrast to all of the midtones in this overall photograph. Hit contrast here, and you'll really see a difference here, and you'll really see an increase in vibrancy as well. And if I turn this all the way up to 100%, this is before and after, before and after. Of course, that is way overkill, but I want to make sure you're able to easily see that at home. But something to about right there, I think, looks pretty good. Now, the sixth thing and the final thing, and I always 100% of the time have to do this inside of Photoshop because Lightroom has no ability to do this whatsoever, and it is focus stacking. So I really wish Lightroom did have the ability to do this, but unfortunately it doesn't. It always has to be done inside of inside of Photoshop. And I've done a couple videos on this. I did a video on automatic focus stacking inside of Photoshop, along with manual focus stacking inside of Photoshop, which I'll link above or link in the description below if you want to take a look at that. But just real quick how this is done. This is my foreground layer right here. This is the background layer. So if I zoom in, you can already see that this rock in the foreground is slightly out of focus and the background is in focus. And then if I come up to the foreground image, the foreground is in focus and the background is out of focus. Because this image right here, there was no way to get the entire scene in sharp focus from front to back in a single shot. So what I'll do is just select both of these. I will come up here to edit and then auto align layers. What auto align layers does is basically just ensures that all the images line up appropriately. You'd be surprised how, especially when your tripod's in moving water, there could be subtle variations, so it'll just automatically align everything for you. As you can see, there's this little white border around the overall image, and that's kind of where the overall image shift, or the overall camera tripod, or maybe with focusing, just shifted just a little bit. And then leaving these two layers highlighted, you can just come up here to edit and select auto blend layers and stack images and hit OK. This process usually takes anywhere from a few seconds to maybe a minute, just depending on how many images you're trying to focus stack. but I find that this works very well. Sometimes it's a little hit and miss with things that are moving, such as moving water in this particular image. You might have to do manual focus stacking with that, or maybe leaves on trees blowing in the wind. Sometimes you want to have to do some type of a manual focus stack for that. But overall, it works very well. And it looks like it just finished right here. This is the merged image right here. And if I zoom in, it looks like it's still thinking right now. You can see that the rock in the foreground is perfectly sharp, and now the background is perfectly sharp as well, and it's all in one single layer. And then you can just kind of go back and either crop in or just kind of clone out these areas where the image shifted just a little bit. But those are the 6 reasons why I always have to leave Lightroom and jump into Photoshop for my post-processing. I still do the vast majority of my editing. It always starts in Lightroom and Capture One, but it always has to finish up inside of Photoshop. But and there's some other techniques that I use. I do some exposure blending inside of Photoshop. I also do some kind of time blending, but those are kind of one-off instances, and those are things that I don't frequently do, not nearly as frequent as the 6 editing techniques that I just mentioned. So before I do wrap up this week's video, I do want to say a big thanks to Squarespace, who is the sponsor of this week's episode, and who I have used from day one for all of my website and e-commerce and blog needs. Squarespace provides a dynamic and attractive online platform to create your website. You can display your photography using Squarespace's professional portfolio designs and customize the layout and look and feel of your gallery just so you can make it your own. With Squarespace's traffic overview feature, you can track trends in page visits and views to better optimize your content, and you can even grow and engage with your customers with Squarespace's email campaign tools, which will enable you to create engaging emails that match your website with your products or blog post and logo, just so your messaging remains consistent. So if you're looking to start a new website or possibly upgrade your current website, check out squarespace.com/Mark Denney for a free trial and 10% off your first purchase. So I do hope that you got at least one nugget of helpful information out of this week's video that you can apply to your post-processing workflow moving forward. Or maybe you're not comfortable using Photoshop. I hope that there's something that was in this video that might help you feel a little bit more comfortable to possibly start testing it out. I know that Photoshop can definitely be extremely intimidating at first, but much like everything, the more you use it, you realize just how simple and how powerful it actually is. So I do appreciate you watching this week's video. Any questions you have, please leave them in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to get back in touch with you ASAP. And if you did enjoy this week's video, if you could give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. And as always, I really, really do appreciate you watching this week's video, and I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.